Hi guys! Today, you'll drift into fascinating stories from the past. Slow, soothing tales that will calm your mind and help you enjoy a deep, restful sleep.
In the quiet fields of medieval Europe, life was measured not by clocks or calendars, but by the steady rhythm of the seasons. The peasants who worked the land were deeply tied to the earth and its cycles, and perhaps nothing tested them more than the long, cold nights of winter. As the sun set early and the frost crept in, these men and women relied on traditions, ingenuity, and sheer endurance to survive. The stone cottages that dotted the countryside were humble structures built from whatever materials were available locally. In some regions, walls were made of wattle and daub, a mixture of woven sticks coated with clay and straw, while in others, large stones were stacked without mortar, their gaps filled with moss or mud to keep out the wind. The roofs were thatched with bundles of dried reeds or straw, which, while far from perfect insulation, did trap a surprising amount of heat. Inside these modest homes, the main source of warmth was the hearth. Usually located in the center of the single main room, the fire was not only used for cooking, but also for heating the entire space. There was no chimney in many peasant houses. Smoke simply escaped through a hole in the roof or through the thatch itself. This made the air inside hazy and pungent, but it also helped keep insects at bay and added a layer of soot that sealed gaps in the roof over time. Families would gather close to the hearth in the evenings, often sleeping nearby in winter nights to share warmth. The entire household, including children, parents, and sometimes even grandparents, might sleep in the same room. Bedding was simple: layers of wool blankets, animal skins, or thick cloth. In some cases, straw mattresses were laid directly on the floor, covered with linen or wool to make them more comfortable. In particularly cold weather, it was not uncommon for livestock, small animals like goats, sheep, or even chickens, to be brought indoors for the night. Their body heat added to the warmth of the room, and their presence meant that precious animals were kept safe from predators. Clothing was another key defense against the cold. Peasants typically wore wool garments during winter, since wool could retain warmth even when damp. A long tunic, often layered with a cloak or a hooded mantle, helped trap heat close to the body. Woolen stockings or leggings were worn, and leather shoes might be stuffed with straw for extra insulation. Hands were sometimes covered with simple mittens, also made from wool or even felted scraps of cloth. While fur was prized for warmth, it was expensive and usually reserved for the wealthy. Peasants might have small pieces of rabbit or sheepskin, but rarely anything more luxurious. Food played a vital role in sustaining energy through the cold months. In winter, the diet was based on stored grains, dried legumes, salted or smoked meats, and root vegetables like turnips and onions that could be kept for months in cool, dark storage pits. Hot pottages, thick stews made from whatever was available were a staple. A simmering pot over the fire not only provided warmth in the room, but also filled the air with the comforting aroma of herbs, grains, and meat scraps. The act of eating together in the warmth of the hearth was as much about survival as it was about nourishment. Nighttime itself was a strange mixture of stillness and sound. Outside, the countryside was quiet except for the occasional howl of a wolf or the creak of tree branches in the wind. Inside, the crackling of the fire and the low murmur of voices filled the darkness. Light came from the flames or from small tallow lamps made by hardening animal fat around a wick. Such lamps provided only a dim glow, but it was enough to move around the room without stumbling. The faint flickering light created deep shadows along the walls, and in this dimness the family might share stories, legends of the past, tales of saints, or even warnings about spirits that wandered on cold winter nights. For those living in the coldest regions, there were additional strategies for staying alive during frigid weather. Some peasants dug small root cellars, partially underground, not only to store food, but to use as emergency shelters when winds became too fierce. In mountain villages, houses might be built partially into a hillside to take advantage of the earth's natural insulation. And while it was rare, there are records of people using heated stones taken from the hearth and wrapped in cloth to warm their beds before sleeping. This small comfort could mean the difference between a restless night and a few hours of deep restorative sleep. The winter months were a test of patience and endurance, and survival depended on cooperation within the household and the village. If one family had more wood than they needed, they might trade with a neighbor who had extra grain. People helped repair each other's roofs, shared preserved food, and looked after the sick. In times when nature's harshness could easily take a life, community was not a luxury, it was essential. As the winter deepened, nights grew longer, and the cold seeped into every crack of a peasant's cottage. Life slowed into a rhythm dictated by survival. Work in the fields was minimal during this season. The earth lay frozen, and snow covered the furrows where crops would later grow. Instead, winter became a time for indoor tasks, repairing tools, mending clothing, and preparing for the warmer months ahead. Wooden plows might be fixed, baskets woven, and wool spun into thread for new garments. In these quieter months, patience and resourcefulness became just as important as physical labor. For many peasants, the long winter evenings were filled with repetitive but essential chores. Women would sit by the fire, spinning wool on simple drop spindles, while men carved wooden handles for tools or patched leather harnesses for animals. Children, when not sleeping, were expected to help, carding wool to remove tangles, gathering kindling, or keeping the fire fed. The steady rhythm of these tasks provided not only warmth and comfort, but also a sense of normalcy in a season when nature itself seemed to sleep. Music and storytelling were the primary entertainments during the cold months. Without printed books for common folk, oral tradition kept history, folklore, and lessons alive. Songs, often accompanied by simple instruments like a lute, pipe, or drum, were passed down through generations. Some songs celebrated the changing seasons, while others told cautionary tales meant to warn against dangers, be they natural or supernatural. The dark nights seemed to invite superstition, and in the flickering firelight, stories of ghosts, wandering spirits, and ancient curses felt especially vivid. The harshness of winter also shaped the diet in subtle ways. While fresh produce was scarce, fermentation and preservation techniques allowed peasants to have a surprising variety of foods. Cabbage might be pickled into sauerkraut, which not only lasted for months, but also provided vital nutrients. Ale brewed from barley was often safer to drink than water during winter months, and served as a source of calories. Some families kept small barrels of mead or cider, which were opened on special occasions, offering brief moments of cheer against the cold. Heating fuel was a constant concern. Wood was valuable, and peasants who lacked access to forests might have to collect fallen branches, brush, or even dried animal dung for their fires. In treeless regions, peat was cut from the ground in warmer months and dried for use as fuel in the winter. Managing the fire so that it lasted through the night was a skill in itself. Too much wood burned too quickly, while too little risked letting the embers die, forcing a cold and difficult restart in the morning. Some households banked their fires at night, covering the glowing coals with ash to keep them smoldering until dawn. Winter also carried a constant risk of illness. The cold weakened the body's defenses, and cramped, smoky homes made the spread of disease more likely. Coughs, fevers, and joint pains were common ailments, and while the wealthy could afford trained physicians, peasants relied on local herbal remedies. Infusions made from dried herbs such as thyme, sage, or yarrow were used to ease symptoms. Honey was added when available, both to sweeten the taste and to soothe the throat. Sometimes these remedies worked, other times they simply provided comfort in a world with few medical options. Life in medieval winter was not just about individual endurance. It was about collective survival. Villages often had unwritten systems of mutual aid. If one family's bread oven was still warm after baking, neighbors might bring their dough to finish cooking. In times of extreme hardship, stronger households might take in orphaned children or the elderly who could not fend for themselves. Religious institutions, especially monasteries, played a role in caring for the needy, offering bread, soup, or even shelter during the harshest nights. Yet, despite all these challenges, there was also a deep resilience among the people. Winter was not only a time of hardship, it was also a season of waiting, of rest, before the demands of spring. The land lay dormant, but so did the endless toil of planting and harvesting. Families drew closer, both physically for warmth and emotionally through shared experiences. The crackle of the fire, the comfort of familiar stories, and the knowledge that the cycle of seasons would turn again were small but powerful sources of hope. And so, night after night, through the howling winds and icy air, medieval peasants endured. They counted the days until the first thaw, knowing that with patience and cooperation, they could survive the winter's grip. Each candle lit against the darkness, each pot of stew shared among family, each log placed carefully on the fire was an act of quiet defiance against the cold, a reminder that life, no matter how humble, could withstand even the longest of nights. In the depths of winter, time itself seemed to stretch and slow. Without the urgency of planting or harvesting, medieval peasants moved through days marked by small, repetitive tasks. The rising of the sun often brought little warmth, but it was still a cue to stir the embers of the fire, tend to the animals, and check the food stores. Every resource had to be carefully rationed. Bread loaves measured against the weeks still left until spring. Barrels of ale tapped sparingly, and salted meats portioned with care. Morning routines began with the quiet scraping of frost from inside the windows, or from the wooden shutters that covered them. Water left overnight might freeze in its bucket, forcing someone to break the thin sheet of ice before it could be used for cooking. Children would be sent outside, wrapped in layers of wool, to fetch fresh water from the nearest well or stream. In colder regions, these water sources might be partially frozen, requiring the use of a wooden mallet or iron tool to break through the surface. Animal care was a priority, even in the bitter cold. Chickens needed feed and sometimes extra bedding to survive the frost. Cows and goats had to be milked, their water troughs checked for ice. In some villages, animals were housed in structures attached to the main living quarters, allowing the heat from their bodies to contribute to the warmth of the household. This arrangement meant more noise and smell indoors, but it was a small price to pay for preserving life in the heart of winter. Cooking during the cold months often relied on dishes that could simmer for hours, using minimal fuel while maximizing flavor and nutrition. A heavy pot might hang over the fire all day, slowly blending grains, vegetables, and small pieces of meat into a filling pottage. Herbs dried in summer, such as parsley, thyme, or marjoram, were crumbled into the pot, giving the food both flavor and a touch of remembered warmth from sunnier days. Occasionally, flatbreads would be baked directly on heated stones near the fire, their scent filling the room. While daylight hours were short, tasks continued indoors as the light faded. Beeswax candles were rare and expensive, reserved for churches or wealthier homes. Most peasants relied on tallow candles or simple oil lamps made from clay, casting a dim but steady light. This glow was enough to weave, carve, or stitch late into the evening. Women might repair worn tunics or patch holes in stockings, while men mended fishing nets, repaired carts, or shaped new wooden handles for tools. Evenings were also a time for teaching children useful skills, how to tie knots, shape clay, or recognize the herbs used for medicine. The long nights encouraged reflection and a closeness with the unseen world. Many believed that winter was a time when spirits roamed more freely. The eerie quiet of snow-covered fields, the distant howl of wolves, and the flickering of firelight all fed these beliefs. Some families placed small charms near the door or above the hearth, meant to ward off misfortune. Others followed simple rituals, knocking 3 times on the door before entering after dark, or placing a piece of bread outside for wandering souls. Whether these acts were rooted in faith, superstition, or simply tradition, they brought comfort. For those who lived near forests, there was also the danger and the necessity of venturing out to gather wood. Winter storms could block paths with snow or bring down branches, creating both hazards and opportunities. Men would sometimes form small groups to collect large logs from the forest edge, dragging them back on sledges. The sound of axes echoing in the cold air was a sign of industry and determination. Every log brought home was a step toward surviving another night. The sense of community in winter was vital. Neighbors often visited each other, not only to share food or warmth, but also to ensure everyone was still well. A knock at the door could mean an offer of freshly baked bread, a request for help repairing a roof, or simply the exchange of news from another part of the village. These visits broke the monotony and reinforced bonds that were essential for survival. Winter was in many ways a test of endurance, but it was also a season that deepened the ties between people and the land they depended on. The fields lay hidden under snow, but they promised life again when the thaw came. Each day survived was a small victory, and each night endured brought them one step closer to the returning sun. In the quiet, in the cold, and in the shared effort to withstand it all, the peasants of medieval Europe found a resilience that carried them through year after year. The heart of the medieval village in winter was often the hearth, not only within each home, but also in the communal spaces, where people occasionally gathered. While most peasants stayed close to their own cottages, there were times when the entire community came together, be it for religious observances, seasonal celebrations, or mutual work. The local church played a central role during these months, serving as a place of worship, warmth, and sometimes refuge from the biting cold. Its stone walls and high windows might not have trapped heat well, but the presence of many bodies, the glow of candles, and the shared singing of hymns created an atmosphere of comfort and solidarity. Winter in the medieval era was marked by specific holy days and feasts, which brought a welcome break from the monotony. Christmas and the 12 days that followed were among the most significant, filled with church services, special meals, and the exchange of small gifts, often handmade or symbolic. Even the poorest families might slaughter a chicken or prepare a richer pottage than usual, savoring the rare indulgence. Candlemas in early February was another important occasion, marking the halfway point between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. On this day, candles were blessed for use throughout the year, and people prayed for the returning warmth of the sun. These celebrations also carried traditions that blurred the lines between Christian and older pagan customs. In some villages, processions with songs and lanterns would wind through the snow-covered streets. In others, people told tales of spirits tied to the season, benevolent ones that brought good fortune, and malevolent ones that threatened to linger until the thaw. For peasants, these stories were not just entertainment. They were a way of understanding the hardships they faced, giving shape to the unseen forces that seemed to govern nature's cycles. Winter work was not limited to survival tasks. This was also the season for craftsmanship. Men with skills in carpentry might fashion new furniture, tool handles, or simple farming implements to sell or trade come spring. Women often wove wool into cloth on simple looms, producing garments not only for their families but also for barter. Children learned by watching and helping, gradually absorbing the skills they would need as adults. The repetitive motion of spinning, weaving, or carving lent itself to quiet conversation, and households often passed the time in this way during the long evenings. Despite the cold, some trade and travel still occurred in winter. Traders with sturdy carts or sledges braved frozen roads to bring salt, cloth, or metal goods to villages. Markets, though smaller than in summer, still took place when weather permitted. These gatherings were a chance for news to spread, stories of distant lands, political events, or simply the fate of neighboring villages. For isolated communities, these visits were precious windows into a wider world, reminding them that life continued beyond their snowy fields. Survival still hinged on careful management of supplies. By midwinter, every household knew exactly how much grain, salted meat, or dried beans remained, and they adjusted meals accordingly. Stretching food was an art, adding more water to the pottage, mixing flour with ground peas to make bread last longer, or boiling bones repeatedly to extract the last bit of flavor. These measures were not seen as desperation, but as part of the rhythm of life, an unspoken understanding that waste in winter could mean hunger before spring. Some winters brought not just cold, but scarcity. Poor harvests from the previous year meant smaller stores, and in such times the village had to decide how to support its most vulnerable members. This could involve pooling resources, organizing communal hunts, or seeking aid from a nearby monastery. While charity was a Christian virtue, it was also a practical necessity. Helping others ensured that the community as a whole survived. The emotional weight of winter could not be ignored. The endless gray skies, the constant chill, and the isolation from the fields took their toll. Yet there were moments of joy, children playing in the snow, the laughter of neighbors sharing a warm drink, or the first signs of thaw along a frozen stream. These glimpses of life and color were treasured, remembered during the darker days as proof that winter would, in time, yield to spring. And so life in a medieval winter was a delicate balance between scarcity and plenty, solitude and togetherness, hardship and celebration. It was a season that demanded resilience, rewarded cooperation, and bound people more tightly to one another and to the land they called home. Each passing day was a step toward the turning of the year, when frozen soil would soften, fields would awaken, and the labors of spring would begin again. The coldest part of winter often came after the new year, when the snow lay deep and the wind cut through the village streets like a knife. In these weeks, even small tasks became challenges. Walking from one end of the village to the other required bracing against icy gusts, and footprints in the snow could vanish within minutes during a storm. People learned to move with purpose, whether fetching water, tending animals, or visiting a neighbor, and then retreat quickly to the shelter of their homes. Inside, the hearth burned almost constantly. Wood was stacked as close to the fire as possible to dry before use, and careful hands ensured no log was wasted. Ashes from the hearth were collected each morning, stored for use in making lye soap, or scattered on icy paths to prevent slipping. Smoke hung in the air, clinging to clothes and hair, a familiar scent that marked both comfort and survival. Food preparation became almost ceremonial during the coldest days. In some villages, bread baking happened in a shared oven to conserve fuel. Families would gather their dough, shaped and ready, and walk together to the communal oven, where a village baker or a rotating household would manage the baking for all. The warm air from the oven was a welcome relief, and the scent of fresh bread often lingered in the village for hours afterward. For those who lived near rivers, winter brought another important task: cutting ice. Large blocks would be sawed from frozen water, hauled back to insulated storage pits lined with straw or sawdust. While some ice was used immediately to preserve meat or cool drinks during rare feasts. Much of it was saved for the warmer months, a rare luxury in a time without refrigeration. The labor was dangerous. The ice could crack unexpectedly, and the frigid water beneath it could claim a life in seconds. But for those who succeeded, the work brought both practical benefits and a certain pride. Life in the cold also demanded close attention to clothing and personal warmth. Cloaks were mended again and again, hoods lined with scraps of wool, and boots repaired with extra stitching. In wealthier households, fur linings might be added to cloaks, but for most peasants, warmth came from layers, wool over linen, with scarves wrapped tightly around the neck. Some even slept in their outer garments, ensuring no body heat was wasted. Even with all these measures, sickness often took hold during the deepest winter months. The winter cough was common, and those with weaker constitutions sometimes did not survive the season. Families relied on herbal infusions, honeyed water, and rest, but in cramped and smoky cottages, illness could spread quickly. Death in winter was met with solemn acceptance. Funerals took place in the frozen ground, sometimes requiring hours of labor to dig a grave through the frost. These moments reminded the living of both the fragility of life and the importance of community. Religious faith played a strong role in enduring the hardships. Priests reminded villagers that winter's trials were part of the divine plan, a test of patience and trust. In addition to formal services, individuals prayed at home, asking for protection from storms, health for their families, and an early spring. Small crosses were sometimes carved into wooden beams or drawn in chalk above doorways, believed to guard against misfortune. Despite the hardships, there were still moments of beauty in these cold weeks. Sunlight reflecting off fresh snow could bathe the village in dazzling brightness. The stillness after a heavy snowfall created a quiet so profound it felt almost sacred. Children, bundled in layers, made small games from sliding on icy patches or shaping snow into crude figures. Couples walked together on clear nights, their breath visible in the cold air, the stars overhead brighter than at any other time of year. For medieval peasants, the depth of winter was a time of both danger and endurance, but also of reflection. The season forced people to slow down, to rely on one another, and to find small joys in shared meals, warm fires, and the knowledge that each day survived brought them closer to the turning of the year. It was a time when the village itself seemed to breathe together, inhale in preparation for the coming spring, exhale in the quiet acceptance of the winter's hold. As winter dragged on, the snow outside became layered with the marks of passing days, footprints, cart tracks, and the small trails left by animals searching for food. In the fields beyond the village, the land lay silent, a vast white plain under a sky often heavy with gray clouds. Farmers knew that beneath this frozen surface, the seeds of spring were waiting, but for now, all life seemed to move in slow motion. Within the cottages, the daily rhythm was well established. Mornings began with coaxing the fire back to life from the embers, a task requiring patience and skill. If the fire had gone completely cold during the night, it meant striking flint to steel, catching the tiny spark in dry tinder, and carefully feeding it until the flame grew strong enough to heat the room again. This simple act was the difference between comfort and a shivering start to the day. Meals were plain but warming. Porridge made from barley or oats was common for breakfast, sometimes sweetened with honey or thickened with milk if the household was fortunate enough to have a cow still producing. Midday meals were often the heartiest, giving people energy for whatever work needed to be done, be it mending fences, tending to livestock, or walking to a neighboring village for trade. Dinner eaten after the early sunset was smaller, often just leftover pottage or bread with cheese. Winter also provided a rare opportunity for certain kinds of work that could not be done in the busy planting and harvest seasons. Timber from felled trees could be shaped into beams or planks, ready for construction projects in spring. Leather from slaughtered animals was cured slowly in the cold air, making it more durable. Wool gathered in autumn could be carded and spun without the distraction of field work. In this way, winter acted as a workshop season where careful preparation laid the foundation for the productivity of the warmer months. For the children of the village, winter was a time of learning as well as play. Older relatives told stories, not just of saints and heroes, but also practical lessons disguised as tales. A story about a hunter who wasted his arrows on crows might serve as a warning to conserve resources. Games played in the snow often mirrored adult work, with children building small walls of packed snow as if constructing houses or pretending to herd imaginary animals. These simple activities taught them the skills and mindset they would need in adulthood. The community continued to look out for its most vulnerable members. Elders unable to leave their homes were brought food and water by younger neighbors. When a roof collapsed under heavy snow, the entire village might turn out to help rebuild it. In a time before official safety nets, survival depended on such acts of mutual care. Each person knew that one day they might be the one in need. Music remained a treasured companion through the dark months. The soft sound of a lute or the clear tone of a small flute could fill a room with warmth, almost as tangible as the fire. Songs often marked the passing of the weeks, with verses for different feasts or prayers for good weather. Some were sung quietly at night, lulling children to sleep, while others were reserved for communal gatherings, where their familiar refrains brought a sense of unity. By late winter, supplies began to run low. The last of the stored apples might be shriveled and soft, the grain sacks lighter than anyone liked, and the salted meat nearly gone. Meals grew plainer, with more bread and broth and fewer rich stews. Yet even in this scarcity, there was an unspoken determination. People had survived winters before, and they would survive this one. The sight of a thawing patch of earth or the first drip of melting snow from a roof could lift spirits immeasurably. In the medieval mind, winter was not an enemy to be defeated, but a challenge to be endured with patience and wisdom. It tested the body and the will, reminded people of their dependence on the land, and deepened the bonds between neighbors. Each year's cold season was a thread in the fabric of life, woven into the larger cycle of planting, growing, and harvesting. And when spring finally arrived, it brought not just warmth and light, but the satisfaction of having endured together the long, quiet struggle of winter. By the time the last stretch of winter arrived, the villagers had become experts at conserving every resource and pacing their energy. The snow, once pristine, was now crusted and hardened by weeks of frost, crunching loudly underfoot. Paths between houses were well trodden, winding like narrow rivers through the deep drifts. Even the animals had worn tracks to and from the barns, their daily journeys a reminder of the quiet persistence that life in winter demanded. Days were slightly longer now, but the cold often felt sharper, the winds stronger. Those who had hoped for an early spring knew better than to trust the fickle weather. A sudden storm could still bury the village under fresh snow, undoing hours of careful work clearing paths. As a result, most people planned their tasks so they could be completed close to home, venturing farther only when absolutely necessary. Food stores were at their lowest during these weeks, and ingenuity became essential. Pottages grew thinner, supplemented with foraged herbs that had been dried months earlier. Root vegetables, soft and wrinkled by now, were chopped finely to stretch them further. Sometimes neighbors shared what little they had, pooling ingredients to create a single large meal for several households. Such feasts were modest, but the act of eating together was a comfort in itself, reminding everyone that hardship was shared, not borne alone. It was during these weeks that tools and equipment were examined for the coming year. Wooden handles were sanded smooth, iron parts inspected for rust, and rope repaired with new fibers. Farmers knew that once the snow melted, the rush of spring work would leave little time for repairs. Some men carved small wooden items for trade, spoons, bowls, or even simple toys for children. Women continued spinning and weaving, their work stacking up in neat piles that would later be sewn into garments or sold at markets. Evenings often brought a certain quiet fatigue. The fire crackled, casting shifting shadows across the walls. Children curled up close to the warmth, listening to stories they already knew by heart, but never tired of hearing. These tales often blended fact and legend, accounts of winters past where the cold had been even harsher or the snow even deeper were told alongside myths of mysterious travelers or strange lights in the night sky. In the soft glow of the fire, the line between truth and imagination blurred. Religious life remained steady through the final weeks of winter. The church bell still rang for services, its sound carrying clearly through the crisp air. Inside, the congregation gathered, their breath visible in the cold, the air scented faintly of incense and tallow candles. The priest spoke of endurance, of the rewards promised to those who remained steadfast. People prayed for the safety of travelers, for the health of newborn animals, and for the first signs of thaw. Sometimes, despite the cold, music and dancing would break the monotony. A small gathering might form in one of the larger cottages, where a fiddle or lute played lively tunes, while boots thumped gently on wooden floors. Space was tight, but laughter and song made the room feel warmer. For a few hours, the darkness outside was forgotten. But alongside these moments of joy, winter still demanded vigilance. Wolves, hungry and bold in the final weeks of scarcity, sometimes ventured closer to the village. Men took turns standing watch, especially at night, to protect livestock. The crunch of snow outside the walls could send a ripple of alertness through a household. Fires were kept burning a little longer into the night, the glow acting as both warmth and warning to any predators. And then, one morning, the signs would begin to show. Water dripping from the thatched roof, a patch of bare earth near the south-facing wall of a cottage, the distant sound of flowing water as a frozen stream began to move again. These were the quiet promises of spring, arriving slowly, almost shyly. The villagers greeted them with cautious optimism, knowing that winter's grip could tighten again before finally letting go. The final stretch was a time of patience, of measured hope. Every day that passed without disaster was a victory. Every shared laugh, every mended garment, every loaf of bread baked was another stitch in the fabric of survival. And when the true thaw finally came, the people of the village would step out into the muddy, awakening fields, not just as survivors of winter, but as its quiet conquerors. The first real thaw of the year was never sudden. It came in hesitant waves. One mild day, followed by 3 bitterly cold ones, then another brief glimpse of warmth. The villagers learned to greet these changes with patience. No one rushed to open their storehouses or begin planting too soon. The memory of past years, when an early start had been punished by a late frost, was still fresh. Still, there was an undeniable shift in the air. The wind carried the faint smell of damp earth, and the birds, silent through most of the winter, began to call to one another again. Snowdrifts shrank slowly, revealing flattened grass and forgotten tools left outside months earlier. Children were the first to take advantage of the softer weather, splashing through shallow puddles and chasing each other through the slushy lanes. The farmers began to walk their fields, inspecting the soil and making notes in their heads about which patches might need extra care. Some land where snowmelt gathered in pools would be too wet to plant immediately. Others, exposed to more sun, would be ready sooner. These early surveys were a quiet ritual, a way of reconnecting with the land after months of being shut indoors. As the ice broke on the streams and rivers, water mills were brought back to life. The sound of the wooden wheels turning again was both practical and symbolic, a sign that work and trade were ready to resume in full. Grain that had been stored over the winter could now be milled into fresh flour, and the villagers took turns bringing their sacks to be ground. The animals, too, felt the change. Cows that had been kept in stalls for months were led outside to stretch their legs, their hooves sinking into the muddy ground. Sheep began to graze on the first green shoots that pushed through the thawing earth. Chickens, restless in their coops, scratched eagerly in the dirt for worms and seeds. These small stirrings of life seemed to mirror the growing energy of the people. Yet spring's arrival also brought a new set of challenges. The roads, once frozen solid, became rivers of mud. Carts sank into the muck, and travelers found themselves moving more slowly than in the snow. The thaw also revealed repairs that would be needed: collapsed fences, leaning walls, and thatch damaged by ice. Every able-bodied villager had to take part in restoring the structures before the busy planting season began. This was also a time for settling accounts. Debts that had been delayed through the winter were now due, whether in coin, grain, or labor. Disputes that had been put aside in the cold months sometimes resurfaced, though most were handled quietly, with an understanding that cooperation was still more valuable than division. The village could not afford to fracture when the year's work was only just beginning. Religious observances marked this period of transition. The church organized processions through the fields, blessing the soil and praying for a fertile season. Candles were lit to honor the saints who protected crops and livestock, and offerings were made in thanks for having survived the winter. These rituals, while rooted in faith, also served a social purpose, bringing the community together at a time when every hand would soon be needed. Evenings, though no longer as long or as dark, were still moments for gathering around the fire. Stories shifted from tales of winter endurance to plans for the year ahead. Who would plant which crops? Which families might trade tools or share seed? And who would travel to nearby markets once the roads improved? All these details were discussed in the warm glow of hearth light. By the time the first true warmth of the season settled in, the village felt transformed. The fields, once silent under snow, now hummed with preparation. The smell of tilled earth filled the air, and the sound of wooden plows creaked steadily across the land. The long, quiet struggle of winter faded into memory, replaced by the urgent, hopeful work of spring. Yet somewhere deep in their minds, the villagers knew that winter would return. The lessons it taught, the value of patience, cooperation, and resilience, would be carried with them until the next snow began to fall. By mid-spring, the village no longer carried the heaviness of winter. The days grew noticeably longer, and with them came an urgency that was almost overwhelming. The quiet patience of the cold months had been replaced by the constant rhythm of work. Every morning began early, sometimes before sunrise, with the ringing of the church bell or the sound of roosters calling across the fields. The plowing was the first great task of the season. Wooden plows, drawn by oxen or sturdy horses, carved deep furrows into the damp soil. Men walked steadily behind them, guiding the blades and calling softly to the animals to keep them moving. The smell of freshly turned earth filled the air, rich and damp, a promise of what the year might bring. Women followed with baskets of seed, carefully scattering them into the furrows before they were covered again. Each step was deliberate, for the seeds represented not just food but survival. Spring was also a time for mending relationships between neighboring villages. With the roads becoming passable, messengers traveled back and forth, carrying news, arranging trades, and sharing stories of how each community had fared through the winter. Markets, still modest in size after the slow season, began to buzz with activity. There was no surplus yet, but the exchange of goods, wool for grain, tools for salt, kept the flow of resources moving. Animals were tended with renewed vigor. Calves and lambs, born in the earliest weeks of spring, now frolicked in the meadows. Chickens roamed freely, their constant scratching and clucking a familiar background sound. Beekeepers checked their hives, relieved to find the bees alive after the cold months, and prepared for the year's honey production. Even the smallest creatures seemed busy, ants building their hills, and birds darting to and from their nests. The villagers also took the time to repair or build new structures that could not be managed in winter. Fences were strengthened to protect the growing crops. Roofs were re-thatched before summer rains could damage them. Barn doors were adjusted to ensure that they could open and close smoothly. The sound of hammers, saws, and the rhythmic thud of wooden mallets echoed through the village from dawn until dusk. Festivals marked the turning of the season. One such celebration honored the planting of the fields with music, dancing, and the blessing of seeds. Families prepared special meals using whatever fresh herbs or early vegetables they could gather. Although modest compared to the feasts of harvest time, these gatherings carried a spirit of joy and renewal. The villagers dressed in their best clothes, bright colors standing out against the green fields and blue skies. Despite the busy days, evenings remained sacred for rest and storytelling. Now, however, the stories had shifted from the long, cold struggles of winter to tales of adventure and travel. The return of peddlers and travelers brought new accounts, rumors of distant wars, strange customs in far-off lands, or miraculous events witnessed on pilgrimages. While most knew these tales were often embellished, they still stirred the imagination and made the world beyond the village feel a little closer. The change of season also brought risks. Sudden storms could flatten young crops, and pests could threaten the delicate balance of the fields. Villagers watched the skies closely, reading the shifting clouds and feeling the wind for signs of rain or trouble. If a neighbor fell ill or an animal was injured, help was given without hesitation, for the work could not stop and no one could be left behind. By the end of spring, the fields were green with young growth. The once bare land now stretched in neat rows, the beginnings of wheat, barley, and oats swaying gently in the breeze. The sense of relief was almost tangible. Winter was now a distant memory, and the village stood in the heart of renewal. Every seed sown was an act of faith in the months ahead, and every hand that worked the land was part of the same quiet promise that they would face the next winter together, just as they had survived the last. As the first weeks of summer approached, the fields grew fuller and the air warmer. The sunlight lingered late into the evening, bathing the land in a golden glow that seemed to stretch time itself. The village moved to a faster rhythm now, but it was a different kind of urgency than spring, less about planting and more about protecting what had been planted. Weeds were a constant battle. Women and children worked alongside the men to pull them from between the young crops, tossing them into piles to dry in the sun. The work was slow, back-breaking, and repetitive, yet essential. A single unchecked patch of weeds could spread quickly, choking out the wheat or barley. Some weeds, however, were kept deliberately. Plants like nettle or dandelion, which could be used for food, medicine, or dye. The livestock were in their prime during these warm days. Cows gave plentiful milk, sheep were sheared for wool, and pigs fattened quickly on the scraps and forage they found. The shearing of sheep was an event in itself. Men worked with shears, while women sorted the wool, washing it in large wooden tubs. The clean fleece would later be spun into thread or woven into cloth for clothing and blankets, adding another layer of self-sufficiency to the village life. Beekeepers, now busy with their hives, watched the flowering meadows closely. Every blossom meant more nectar for the bees, and in turn more honey for the villagers. Honey was not only a rare sweetness in the medieval diet, but also an important preservative and medicine. In years when flowers bloomed heavily, the honey harvest was celebrated with small feasts, and jars were set aside for winter. Work and celebration often intertwined. On warm evenings, after a long day in the fields, musicians would take out fiddles, flutes, or drums. Dances were held on the village green, where young people could meet and elders could enjoy the sight of life continuing in its timeless cycles. Even the simplest gatherings, just a few jugs of ale, bread, and music, were cherished moments that kept the spirit of the community strong. Trade increased during these months. With roads now dry and safe to travel, merchants passed through with goods from far-off towns. Spices, fine cloth, and crafted tools were among the most prized items, though they were expensive and often beyond the reach of poorer families. Still, the arrival of traders brought excitement, and villagers often gathered just to see what new wares had arrived, even if they could not afford to buy them. The summer sun also carried dangers. Drought was a constant fear. Too many dry days could stunt the crops, while too much rain could flood the fields. Farmers looked to the sky daily, hoping for the right balance of weather. Some turned to old superstitions, hanging herbs in doorways, making offerings at the church, or even ringing bells to ward off storms. Whether these rituals truly worked was less important than the comfort they brought. As the days grew longer, children played more freely, exploring the woods and meadows, fishing in streams, and helping gather wild berries. Their laughter filled the air, a reminder that life in the village was not all toil and hardship. The elders, sitting outside in the warm air, would often smile at these sights, remembering their own youth and knowing the cycle would continue long after they were gone. By midsummer, the crops stood tall and strong, their heads beginning to form. This was the point where the farmers could see whether the year's labor would bear fruit or grain. Hope was high, but caution remained, for pests or storms could still undo months of work. Every villager knew that even in the warmth and brightness of summer, they were always living with one eye on the coming winter. By late summer, the air grew heavy with the scent of ripening grain. The once green fields shifted to shades of gold and amber, their heads bending under the weight of the coming harvest. The village seemed to move with a quiet anticipation, as if everyone knew the most important work of the year was drawing near. In these weeks, every eye was on the weather. A storm at the wrong moment could flatten entire fields, undoing months of effort. The villagers checked the sky several times a day, reading the shape and color of the clouds with practiced eyes. Children were sometimes sent running through the lanes to carry urgent news, rain coming from the west, so that everyone could prepare. Before the harvest itself began, the tools had to be ready. Sickles and scythes were sharpened to a fine edge, and wooden handles were inspected for cracks. Rope was braided for tying sheaths, and large baskets were repaired or replaced. Men worked together to test and mend the carts that would carry the grain from the fields to the barns, knowing that a broken wheel in the middle of harvest could waste precious time. Livestock care became even more important now. Oxen and horses needed to be well fed and rested, for they would be pulling heavy loads during the harvest. Dogs were kept close to help guard the stored grain from thieves or wild animals. Cats, valued for their hunting skills, roamed the barns and granaries freely, keeping the mouse population in check. Even in the midst of preparation, the village took moments to mark the turning of the season. A small midsummer feast often gave way to quieter gatherings as the heat began to fade. In the evenings, neighbors visited one another to share cool ale, talk about the harvest to come, and exchange advice on storing and preserving the grain. These visits were more than just social. They were a way to keep the community united before the exhausting work ahead. Wild foraging also reached its peak in late summer. Women and children collected berries, nuts, and mushrooms from nearby woods, adding variety to the diet and storing what they could for winter. Herbs were harvested and dried, hanging in bunches from the rafters. The smell of drying rosemary, sage, and thyme filled the homes, mixing with the ever-present scent of wood smoke from the kitchen hearths. The evenings grew just slightly cooler, a reminder that autumn was close. This change was felt in the pace of work, steady, but with an underlying tension. There was no telling whether the year's efforts would be rewarded with abundance or dashed by a sudden misfortune. Everyone worked with the unspoken understanding that the harvest was a test and the results would determine how well the village could endure the winter. At times, traveling peddlers brought news of other regions, some where harvests had failed due to floods, others where fields were overflowing with grain. These stories were met with a mix of sympathy and quiet hope that fortune would smile on their own village. Trade routes were already being considered for the post-harvest period, when grain could be exchanged for goods that the village could not produce itself. In the final days before the harvest began, the fields were almost sacred ground. Children were warned not to play among the grain, and paths through the fields were walked with care. There was a sense of reverence for the land, as if it were a living thing that had worked alongside the villagers all year. Soon the grain would be cut, the fields would stand bare again, and the cycle would begin anew. The first day of harvest began before the sun had fully risen. A thin mist clung to the fields, and the air was cool enough that the workers could see their breath. Men, women, and even older children gathered with sickles and scythes in hand, ready to begin the most important task of the year. The low murmur of voices, the creak of wagon wheels, and the clink of metal tools created a rhythm that would define the days to come. Cutting grain was relentless work. Bent over in the fields, workers grasped handfuls of stalks and sliced through them with practiced motions. The freshly cut grain was tied into bundles, sheaves, that were left to dry in the sun before being stacked in tall, conical shapes. The smell of the grain was rich and sweet, a promise of bread and porridge for the cold months ahead. The work was not without hazards. The sharp blades could cause serious injury, and the constant bending strained backs and legs. The sun, once it rose higher, beat down fiercely on the workers, making water breaks essential. Buckets were brought out to the fields, and children ran between the rows carrying wooden cups of water or small loaves of bread to keep the laborers' strength up. Timing was everything. The harvest had to be done quickly enough to avoid rain spoiling the crop, but carefully enough to prevent waste. If the grain was left too long in the field, it could shatter and fall to the ground, lost to the wind and birds. The entire village understood this urgency, and even those too young or too old to work in the fields found ways to help, minding the children, preparing meals, or guarding the drying grain. At midday, the workers paused for a brief meal, sitting in the shade of hedges or haystacks. Bread, cheese, and onions were the usual fare, sometimes with a jug of ale to share. Conversations were short. Everyone knew that the afternoon would be as demanding as the morning. Still, there was a quiet satisfaction in seeing the cut fields grow larger each hour, the golden stubble marking their progress. In the evenings, wagons loaded with sheaves made their way to the barns and granaries. Inside, the grain was stored carefully, protected from dampness and pests. The rhythmic thud of the flails used to separate the grain from the stalks would become a familiar sound in the weeks ahead. Dust hung in the air inside the barns, and the scent of drying grain mixed with the earthy smell of wood and straw. The harvest was not just work, it was a communal effort that drew the entire village together. Songs were often sung in the fields to keep morale high, their steady beats matching the swing of the scythes. In some villages, a small portion of the first sheaf cut was set aside as an offering, either to God or to older traditions that predated the church. This was a way of giving thanks for the harvest and hoping for good fortune in the year to come. As the days went on, the fields grew emptier, replaced by neatly stacked sheaves and cart tracks pressed deep into the soil. There was a certain beauty in the sight. The land had given all it could, and the villagers had taken it with gratitude. Yet everyone knew the work was far from over. The grain still needed to be threshed, winnowed, and stored, and the livestock fed on the leftover straw. By the end of the first week, the villagers were tired but determined. Their hands were rough from the tools, their faces darkened by the sun, and their clothes smelled of grain and sweat. But the barns were filling, and that was all that mattered. The knowledge that their efforts would carry them through the winter gave strength to continue. Once the last of the grain had been cut and gathered, the village shifted its focus to the next crucial stage, processing the harvest. The barns and granaries were full, but the grain could not be eaten or traded in its current state. It had to be freed from its husks, cleaned, and stored in a way that would keep it safe through the long winter. The process began with threshing. Inside the barns, men and women stood over large piles of dried sheaves laid across wooden floors. Each held a flail, a wooden staff connected by a short leather strap to a second, shorter stick. With steady, rhythmic motions, they swung the flails down onto the sheaths, striking them until the kernels of grain fell free from the stalks. The sound was like a drumbeat echoing off the barn walls in a slow, relentless rhythm. Threshing was exhausting work. The dust rose in thick clouds, clinging to hair and skin, making eyes water and throats dry. The air was hot and close inside the barns, even when the doors stood open to let in fresh air. Workers often tied cloths over their mouths and noses, not only to keep out the dust, but also to warm the air in the cooler mornings. After threshing came winnowing, the process of separating the grain from the chaff and straw. This was often done outside, where the wind could help. Large, shallow baskets or wooden trays were filled with the mixture of grain and husks, then tossed into the air so that the lighter chaff would blow away while the heavier grain fell back into the container. On still days, helpers would fan the air with large pieces of cloth or woven mats to mimic a breeze. Winnowing was a skill in itself. Too much force and good grain would be lost. Too little and bits of husk would remain. The work was repetitive, but strangely satisfying, as each pass left the grain cleaner and more golden. The piles of finished grain grew steadily, and with them the sense of security in the village. Once cleaned, the grain was carried in sacks or wooden tubs to storage bins. These were built to keep out moisture and pests, often raised off the ground on stone supports. Some wealthier households had small granaries of their own, while most of the village stored their share in a communal building under the watch of a trusted elder. The leftover straw and chaff were not wasted. Straw was used for animal bedding, thatching roofs, and even weaving mats and baskets. Chaff, though not suitable for humans, was sometimes mixed into animal feed. In a medieval village, nothing was thrown away if it could be put to use. During these weeks, the whole village still worked together, though the pace was different from the frantic rush of the harvest. The days were filled with the steady hum of labor, and evenings brought a quieter satisfaction. Sometimes small celebrations were held when the last of the grain was stored. Simple meals with music and dancing, marking the end of one chapter and the preparation for the next. With the grain safely put away, the village could turn its attention to other autumn tasks: slaughtering animals for meat, preserving fruits and vegetables, and repairing homes before the winter storms arrived. But the memory of the harvest and its hard-won results lingered. Each sack of grain was a reminder of the sweat, skill, and cooperation that had brought it from the fields to the storehouse. As the last golden leaves fell from the trees, and the wind began to carry the bite of approaching frost, the village shifted into its final stage of preparation for winter. The harvest was complete, the grain stored safely away, but survival in the cold months ahead required far more than food alone. Every household turned its attention to preserving meat, repairing shelters, and ensuring there would be enough warmth to last until spring. One of the most important tasks of late autumn was the slaughtering of livestock. Animals that could not be fed through the winter were humanely killed, their meat preserved for the months ahead. Pigs, sheep, and sometimes cattle were brought into the yard, where skilled butchers performed their work quickly to avoid unnecessary suffering. Every part of the animal was used: meat salted or smoked, fat rendered into tallow for candles, hides prepared for leather, and bones saved for tools or broth. Salt was precious and not always abundant, but it was the most reliable way to preserve meat. Large wooden tubs were filled with layers of pork or beef packed in coarse salt, drawing out the moisture that could cause decay. Smoking was another common method. The meat was hung in smoke houses, where smoldering fires of oak or apple wood gave it both preservation and flavor. The smell of wood smoke and curing meat was a familiar sign of the season. While the men often handled butchering, women took charge of preserving vegetables and fruits. Root crops like turnips, carrots, and parsnips were stored in cellars or pits lined with straw to keep them from freezing. Apples and pears were laid out on wooden racks in cool, dark rooms, while herbs were hung in bunches from rafters to dry. Cabbages were sometimes turned into sauerkraut, a method learned from older traditions that kept food edible for months. Repairing homes was another urgent job. Thatched roofs were inspected for leaks, and new bundles of straw were tied in place where needed. Wattle and daub walls were patched with fresh clay, and wooden shutters were checked to ensure they could be closed tightly against the wind. Chimneys were cleared of soot to reduce the risk of fire, and doors were reinforced with extra planks to keep out both cold drafts and hungry animals. Clothing, too, needed attention. Wool from the summer shearing had been spun into yarn, and now it was woven into cloth or knitted into warm garments. Old coats were mended, and sheepskin or fur was sewn into cloaks for the coldest days. Mittens, scarves, and woolen caps were made in abundance, especially for the children, who would still have to help with chores even in the snow. Firewood was gathered and stacked high, often in neat circular piles that shed rain. In some places, peat was also cut and dried to serve as fuel. The work was heavy and tiring, but without a good stockpile of fuel, No family could hope to keep warm through the long winter nights. The smell of fresh-cut wood and the steady thud of axes became part of the season's soundtrack. The evenings of late autumn were often spent indoors by the hearth. While the days were still busy with work, the longer nights allowed for moments of storytelling, singing, and small gatherings among neighbors. It was a time when people shared news, recited prayers for a safe winter, and exchanged small gifts of preserved food or crafted goods. These moments helped to strengthen the bonds that had been forged in the hard labor of the harvest. By the time the first snow fell, the village had transformed. The fields lay bare, the orchards silent, and the barns heavy with the fruits of months of labor. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the smell of wood fires drifted through the crisp air. The people knew the cold would test them, but they also knew they had done all they could to prepare. Winter was no longer a distant threat. It was here, and they were ready to face it. Winter in the medieval countryside arrived not with a single snowstorm, but with a gradual tightening of the cold. At first, the frost would appear in the mornings, turning the thatched roofs white and stiffening the ground underfoot. Then, as the days grew shorter, snow began to fall in gentle flurries, blanketing the fields and forest in silence. Soon, the world beyond the village seemed locked away beneath a layer of white. For peasants, winter was both a time of rest from the endless field work and a season of constant vigilance. With no crops to tend, the focus shifted to survival indoors. Fires had to be kept burning at all times, for without steady warmth, the cold could seep into the walls and freeze water in the buckets overnight. The hearth was the center of life, and its glow was often the only light in the house during the long nights. Meals in winter were simple but filling. Thick soups made from root vegetables and preserved meat simmered for hours in large iron pots, filling the home with warmth and aroma. Bread was baked less often to save fuel, so loaves were larger and meant to last several days. Salted pork, smoked fish, and dried beans were common staples, each bite a reminder of the careful planning done in autumn. With the land frozen, work moved indoors. Tools were repaired, wooden handles replaced, and baskets mended. Women spun wool into yarn and wove cloth on simple looms, while men crafted new sledges or fixed harnesses for animals. These quiet tasks kept hands busy and minds occupied, for idle days could feel unbearably long. Children, though spared from the heaviest labor, were not free from chores. They fetched water from wells that were sometimes frozen over, carried firewood from outdoor stacks, and fed the animals in the byre. Feeding livestock in winter was no small task. Hay had to be rationed carefully so that it would last until spring. Cows and goats were kept in sheltered barns, their body heat helping to keep the chill at bay. Yet even in the harshness of winter, there were moments of joy. On clear, crisp days, children played in the snow, making shapes with their footprints or sliding down small hills on wooden boards. Adults, too, found ways to pass the time, telling stories by the fire, singing old songs, or playing games with dice and carved wooden pieces. These small pleasures were vital in keeping spirits high during the darkest months. Religious life took on special importance in winter. Christmas and Candlemas brought the village together for services, feasts, and processions. Church bells rang out across the snow, and the sound carried far in the still air. For many, faith provided comfort and the hope that the harsh season would pass. The coldest nights were the most dangerous. When the wind howled and snow fell heavily, travel became impossible. Villagers stayed indoors, checking on their neighbors when they could, for a single missed fire could mean disaster. The roofs were carefully cleared of heavy snow to prevent collapse, and doors were barred against wolves or other hungry creatures that prowled closer in winter. Time in winter seemed to stretch endlessly, yet every day brought the village closer to the promise of spring. By late February, the sun lingered a little longer in the sky, and the snow began to soften. The villagers knew that soon they would return to the fields, but for now they stayed by their fires, keeping the cold at bay with food, work, and each other's company. By late winter, the charm of the snow had long since faded, replaced by the biting wind and the creeping anxiety of dwindling supplies. What had once been well-stocked cellars now held fewer sacks of grain, and the barrels of salted meat grew lighter by the week. Every family knew that the last stretch before spring was the most dangerous, when hunger, illness, and cold could strike with the greatest force. Meals became simpler, the portions smaller. Bread might be made with a greater share of rye or oats, which were hardier but less prized than wheat. Dried peas and beans, boiled into thick pottages, appeared on the table more often, sometimes flavored only with onions or leeks. On rare occasions, a bit of smoked pork or fish was added, but most meat was carefully rationed to last until the first green shoots appeared in the fields. Fuel for the hearth also ran low. The neat stacks of firewood from autumn had shrunk, and the best logs were already burned. What remained were smaller branches, bark, and bundles of twigs gathered from the forest edge. In some households, dried animal dung was used to keep the fire alive, a common but unpleasant necessity in hard winters. Illness often came during these lean months. The cold weakened the body, and the lack of fresh food made it harder to fight off fevers or coughs. The village healer, often an elderly woman with knowledge of herbs, did what she could with dried remedies stored since summer: elderberry, chamomile, yarrow. But many simply had to endure until warmer days returned. Even the livestock felt the strain. Hay supplies were carefully measured each day, and the animals were given just enough to keep them alive and strong enough for spring work. The cows produced less milk, and the hens laid fewer eggs, both signs of the toll winter took on living creatures. The barn was a place of quiet endurance, where man and beast alike waited for the thaw. Despite these hardships, life went on. The village still gathered on Sundays for church, walking carefully along icy paths, the sound of boots crunching in the snow. In these moments, people drew strength from their shared struggles, offering each other help where they could. A loaf of bread or a bundle of sticks given to a neighbor might mean the difference between comfort and suffering. Children's laughter was rarer now, but not gone. They still played when the weather allowed, sliding across frozen ponds or carving shapes into the snow with sticks. These moments of joy were brief but precious, bright spots in the otherwise gray days of February. In the evenings, the glow of firelight became a sanctuary. Families huddled close, telling tales from the past, stories of ancestors who had survived even harsher winters, of wolves driven from the edge of the forest, of years when the snow came early and stayed late. These tales carried a quiet lesson. Survival depended on patience, preparation, and community. By March, the first signs of change began to appear. The days grew longer, and the sun's warmth could be felt on clear afternoons. Snow melted from the south-facing slopes, revealing patches of brown earth. Streams began to run more freely, their icy crusts breaking apart with a soft trickle. These small shifts brought hope, but everyone knew that the final weeks could still hold storms and frost. The villagers moved cautiously into this transitional time, balancing the use of their last supplies with the anticipation of spring planting. The end of winter was in sight, but until the fields turned green again, every day still demanded care and resilience. Spring did not arrive in a single day. It crept slowly into the village, first as a faint softness in the air, and the scent of damp earth beneath the melting snow. The first real sign came when the icicles hanging from the eaves began to drip steadily, their water pooling in muddy tracks outside the cottages. The sound of running water returned to the streams, a gentle music that seemed to promise renewal. The villagers greeted these changes with cautious optimism. Experience had taught them that late frosts could still strike, undoing days of warmth. Yet there was no denying that the land was waking. Small green shoots appeared in sheltered spots, and the first snowdrops pushed their way through the thinning snow. With the thaw came work. The fields, still wet and heavy, needed to be prepared for planting. Men walked the boundaries of their strips, checking fences and clearing away fallen branches. As soon as the ground was soft enough, the plows were brought out. Oxen strained against their harnesses, pulling the wooden blades through the earth, turning the soil that had slept all winter. The smell of freshly turned ground mixed with the cool spring air. Women also had their share of spring tasks. Seeds carefully stored through the winter were sorted and measured. Garden plots near the cottages were cleared of debris, ready for early crops like onions, peas, and cabbages. In some cases, herbs were planted indoors in pots to get an early start before the outdoor soil warmed fully. Animals, too, responded to the season. The cows gave richer milk, the hens laid more eggs, and the sheep's wool grew thick in preparation for shearing later in the season. The byres were cleaned out, letting in fresh air and sunlight. Despite the return of activity, spring was also a season of hunger. The last of the winter stores had to stretch until the first vegetables could be harvested. Meals might still be meager, thin soups flavored with whatever herbs could be found, bread made from the last of the grain, and milk from the cows. But the promise of fresh food soon gave people the strength to keep working. Village life grew more social again. Neighbors stopped to talk in the lanes, discussing the state of their fields or sharing news of births and marriages. Children, freed from the heavy snows, roamed farther, exploring the muddy edges of the forest and splashing in shallow streams. Laughter returned to the open spaces. Religious festivals marked the season's turning. Easter was a time of both devotion and celebration, with the church decorated in fresh greenery and flowers. The service was followed by feasts, music, and dancing on the village green. For a moment, the hardships of winter were forgotten, replaced by the joy of survival and the hope of a fruitful year ahead. The weather, however, could still test the villagers. Heavy rains sometimes flooded the low-lying strips, washing away carefully planted seeds. Cold winds could return overnight, forcing everyone to cover their young plants. But these challenges were met with the quiet determination learned over generations. Nature was unpredictable, but work and patience could still bring reward. As the days lengthened, the village settled into its spring rhythm. The smell of smoke from the hearth mixed with the fresh scent of grass. Tools clinked in the fields, and the air rang with the calls of birds returning from their winter absence. The long, dark months were behind them, and though work lay ahead, it was work filled with purpose and the promise of growth. By mid-spring, the land was alive with activity. The days had grown warmer, and the fields, once sodden with meltwater, now bore neat lines of freshly sown seeds. Everywhere there was movement, oxen pulling plows, men swinging hoes, and women bent over the soil, pressing seeds carefully into the furrows. The rhythm of the work was steady, almost meditative, broken only by the calls of birds and the occasional bark of a dog guarding the livestock. Villagers knew that these weeks were crucial. The planting had to be completed before the heat of summer arrived. Every able-bodied person took part. Elders sorted seeds. Children scared away crows, and the strongest worked the heavy plows. Some planted barley for brewing, others rye and oats for bread, and small kitchen gardens flourished with leeks, onions, and herbs. The marketplace in the nearby town grew livelier as the roads became passable again. Farmers carried surplus eggs, butter, and wool to sell or trade for tools, salt, and cloth. News traveled quickly in these markets. Stories of distant lands, changes in the king's court, or rumors of conflict that might one day touch their own village. For many, these trips to market were the highlight of the season, a chance to see new faces and hear the latest tales. Animals thrived in the milder weather. The sheep grazed on tender green grass, their wool thick and soft. Goats climbed the rocky slopes near the village, nibbling at young shoots. The cows, well fed now, gave milk in abundance, and fresh cheese returned to the tables. The poultry yard was full of activity. Hens clucked over their chicks, and ducks waddled down to the pond. The forest also yielded its first gifts. Villagers gathered wild herbs, young nettles, and edible greens to add variety to their meals. Some ventured deeper to collect honey from wild hives or to fish in the streams. These small treasures brought excitement to the daily routine, and they marked the shift from the lean days of winter to the richness of the growing year. Festivals and fairs became more frequent. The village green hosted gatherings with music from simple pipes and drums, dancing in circles, and contests of strength and skill. At such events, young people met and sometimes arranged marriages, while older villagers traded gossip and discussed the progress of the crops. Laughter and singing carried into the warm evenings, mingling with the scent of blooming flowers. Yet spring was not without its challenges. A sudden storm could flatten young plants, and pests could destroy weeks of careful work. Villagers kept watch for signs of trouble, ready to replant or protect their crops as needed. The fear of a poor harvest lingered in everyone's mind. Memories of past famines were never far away. The church remained central to village life. Blessings for the fields were performed, and processions sometimes wound their way through the farmland. Priests sprinkling holy water and chanting prayers for a fruitful year. These rituals reinforced the bond between the people, their work, and the land that sustained them. By late spring, the fields shimmered with the promise of the months ahead. Grain sprouted in neat rows, and the gardens were lush with green. The air was alive with the hum of insects, the rustle of leaves, and the calls of swallows darting through the sky. The cycle of life in the village had turned again from endurance to growth, and the people looked toward the future with guarded hope. Early summer brought a warmth that settled over the village like a comforting blanket. The days stretched long, the sun rising before the roosters and setting late, painting the horizon in deep golds and soft purples. This was the season when work reached its peak, but it was also the time when the land seemed most generous. The fields were now green and full of life. Young grain swayed gently in the breeze, and the vegetable plots near the cottages brimmed with leafy growth. Every day, men and women alike moved through the rows, weeding, tending, and checking for pests. Children carried water from the well, their bare feet dusted with earth, their faces warm from the sun. Herb gathering became an important task. The women of the village ventured into the meadows and woodland edges to collect plants at their peak potency. Chamomile for calming teas, mint for flavoring, and yarrow for treating wounds. Elder blossoms were picked for syrups, and wild strawberries, small but sweet, were eaten fresh or preserved for later. The air was rich with the scent of cut grass and blooming flowers. The sheep were sheared in early summer, their thick winter coats removed and stored for spinning. Shearing days were lively events, with families gathering to help and to share food afterward. The sight of freshly shorn sheep, lighter and more agile, was a sure sign that the warm months had truly arrived. Wool was washed in the river and laid out to dry, ready for carding and spinning in the months ahead. By mid-season, the hay meadows demanded attention. Cutting the hay was hard work, requiring sharp scythes and careful timing. If cut too early, it would lack the strength to feed animals through winter. Too late, and the plants would lose their nourishment. Once cut, the hay was turned daily so it could dry evenly under the summer sun. The smell of drying hay filled the air, sweet and earthy. The arrival of summer also brought celebrations. The solstice was marked with music, dancing, and bonfires on the village green. Young people leapt over small fires for luck, while older villagers shared stories of past years. Garlanded with flowers, everyone feasted on bread, cheese, fresh greens, and honey. The celebrations stretched late into the night, the firelight flickering on smiling faces. Markets in the town were busier than ever, with farmers bringing early produce and freshly shorn wool. Traders from other regions arrived, their carts laden with spices, pottery, and fine fabrics. Such sights filled the villagers with both wonder and a hint of longing for the wider world beyond their fields. Life, though, was never without risk. A single week of heavy rain could flatten crops, and too much heat could dry out the fields. The people had learned to adapt, adjusting their work to the weather, storing extra water when possible, and repairing irrigation ditches. Each summer was different, but the rhythm of labor and reward remained constant. As the season deepened, the village seemed to hum with contentment. The animals were healthy, the fields thrived, and the storehouses began to fill again. There was still much work ahead, but for now the land gave generously, and the people took joy in its abundance. Late summer was the season of both satisfaction and urgency. The fields that had been carefully sown and tended through spring and early summer were now heavy with grain, vegetables, and fruit. The days were still long, but there was a subtle shift in the air, a hint of dryness, a quiet reminder that autumn was approaching. Harvest began early in the mornings, before the sun could become too fierce. Men wielded sickles, moving methodically through the ripened grain, while women and older children followed behind, bundling the stalks into sheaths. The work was steady, almost ceremonial, but it required stamina and coordination. Every hand was needed, for the timing of the harvest could mean the difference between abundance and hunger in the winter to come. The first fields to be cut were often barley and oats, followed by rye and wheat. Each type of grain had its own use: barley for ale, rye for bread, oats for both people and animals. As the sheaves were gathered, they were carried to the threshing floor, where they would later be beaten to separate grain from chaff. The sound of flails striking the stalks was a familiar rhythm of late summer evenings. Beyond the grain, the gardens and orchards were bursting with produce. Beans, peas, leeks, and onions were gathered daily. Cabbages grew in tight, dense heads, and carrots were pulled from the earth with their sweet, sharp scent. Fruit trees gave their bounty: apples, pears, and plums, while hedgerows offered blackberries, ripe and staining the fingers deep purple. Some of the harvest was eaten fresh, but much was preserved. Apples stored in cool lofts, beans dried, and berries turned into thick, dark preserves. Preservation was as important as gathering. Women and older children spent long hours in smoky kitchens, drying herbs, boiling fruit with honey, and salting fish. Meat from animals slaughtered before winter was cured and hung, while excess milk was turned into hard cheeses that could last for months. Every shelf, chest, and storage jar in the village was filled with care, each holding the promise of survival during the long, cold months ahead. This was also the time for collecting firewood. Men ventured into the forests with carts, axes, and saws, cutting fallen branches and felling trees that would provide heat and cooking fuel through the winter. The scent of fresh-cut wood mixed with the earthy smell of drying grain, creating an atmosphere that seemed unique to this season. Despite the intensity of the work, late summer had its moments of celebration. The completion of the grain harvest was often marked by a small feast, sometimes called the harvest home. The last sheaf of grain might be decorated with ribbons and flowers, then placed in a place of honor until the next planting season. Songs were sung, ale was poured, and there was a feeling of gratitude for the earth's generosity. Travelers and merchants were still common on the roads, carrying goods between towns and villages. With the harvest in full swing, many brought extra laborers seeking work in exchange for food or coin. These newcomers sometimes shared tales from distant regions, stories of war, strange customs, or lands where the weather was never cold. The church played its part in late summer as well. Special masses were held to bless the harvest, and tithes were collected, often a portion of the grain or produce, which was stored in the church's own granary to feed the poor or to sustain the clergy through winter. The relationship between faith and farming was deeply intertwined. For many villagers, a good harvest was not just a matter of skill and weather, but also divine favor. As the sun dipped earlier in the evening, the light took on a golden quality, casting long shadows across the fields. The air was warm, but held a hint of coolness after dark. The village, though busy from dawn to dusk, felt alive with a sense of purpose. It was the culmination of months of labor, and everyone knew that becoming weeks would decide the comfort or hardship of the year ahead. In those late summer nights, with the sounds of crickets in the grass and the smell of ripe grain drifting through the open shutters, the people of the village might allow themselves a brief moment of peace. There would always be more work tomorrow, but for now the barns were filling, the storehouses growing heavy, and the people could feel a quiet, satisfying assurance that they had done what they could to prepare for the turning of the seasons. Autumn's first breath arrived quietly, almost unnoticed at first. The mornings grew cooler, with a faint mist curling over the fields, and the evenings came sooner, shadows stretching long before the last chores were done. The air carried a crispness that seemed to sharpen sounds, the lowing of cattle, the creak of wagon wheels, the rustle of leaves beginning to turn. The early autumn weeks were a time of gathering what remained in the fields and preparing for the months ahead. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, and beets were pulled from the soil and packed away in cool cellars, layered with straw to keep them from freezing. Pumpkins and squashes, their skins hardened under the late summer sun, were stacked neatly in storage sheds. These hardy crops would form the backbone of winter meals when fresh greens were scarce. In the orchards, the last of the apples were harvested. Some were pressed into cider, a task that brought the whole village together. Wooden presses groaned under the weight of the fruit, and the air was sweet with juice. Cider would be enjoyed fresh in the weeks to come, but much of it was stored to ferment slowly, becoming a warming drink for the cold nights ahead. Livestock, too, needed special attention. The animals grazed the last of the fresh pasture before being moved closer to the village for winter shelter. Chickens were given extra feed to prepare them for the months when insects and green forage would be gone. Pigs were fattened for slaughter, their meat destined for curing, salting, and smoking. Firewood was stacked high by every home, the neat piles a visible sign of readiness. In the evenings, when the day's work was done, the smell of wood smoke began to drift through the air as families lit small fires against the growing chill. The flicker of flames in hearths cast a warm glow on the walls, making even the simplest cottage feel safe and welcoming. Autumn was also a time of mending and making. Clothes worn thin during the summer were patched, and new garments were sewn from wool spun in the warmer months. The spinning wheel hummed in many homes, and knitting needles clicked by candlelight. Leather shoes were repaired, and tools were sharpened, ready for winter tasks. One of the most important events of the season was the slaughtering of animals before winter. It was a somber but necessary time, ensuring that only as many animals were kept alive as could be fed through the cold months. Families worked together to butcher and preserve the meat, salting, smoking, and storing it carefully. Sausages were hung from rafters, and jars of rendered fat were sealed and set aside for cooking. With the shortening days came a shift in the village's rhythm. Fieldwork slowed, replaced by more indoor activities. Yet the sense of urgency remained. Everything had to be done before the first true frost. Repairs to roofs and walls were completed. Barns were checked for leaks, and paths were cleared so that movement between buildings would be easier when snow arrived. The changing season also brought a certain beauty. The trees at the edge of the forest turned shades of gold, crimson, and amber. Leaves fell in slow spirals to the ground, gathering in drifts along fences and ditches. The sky, often a clear pale blue, could shift quickly to heavy gray, bringing sudden rains that pattered on thatched roofs. The church calendar marked important days in autumn, feasts to give thanks for the harvest, saints' days that drew the community together in prayer and modest celebration. These gatherings provided moments of rest and reflection amid the constant work. People shared what they had, knowing that the bonds of the community were as vital as the food stored in their cellars. By late autumn, a certain quietness began to settle over the land. The fields lay bare, their work done for the year. Flocks of birds moved overhead, heading south, their calls fading into the distance. The village itself seemed to draw inward, like a creature preparing for hibernation. Still, the people knew that the hardest months were yet to come. The cold would test their stores, their strength, and their patience. But for now, as they looked at the full granaries, the neatly stacked firewood, and shelves heavy with jars and sacks, they felt a cautious confidence. Winter would come as it always did, but they were ready to meet it. Late autumn brought with it a sharp change in the air. The mornings were no longer just cool, they were edged with frost. Thin white crystals coated the grass, the fence posts, and the thatched roofs, catching the pale light of the rising sun. The ground grew firm underfoot, and puddles from earlier rains froze into brittle skins of ice that cracked under the weight of a step. The days shortened noticeably now. Dawn came reluctantly, and dusk fell swiftly, the light fading into a muted twilight before giving way to long, still nights. In the fields, little work remained except for tending animals and checking the boundaries. Most crops were already stored, though some hardy greens like kale and winter cabbage still clung to life, their leaves toughened by the cold. With the harvest behind them, the villagers turned their attention fully to preparation. Any unfinished tasks, mending fences, patching roofs, clearing chimneys, were done with a kind of urgency. No one wanted to face the first heavy snow with a leaky roof or a blocked flue. The nights grew colder, and the hearth became the heart of every home. Fires were lit earlier in the evening and fed more generously. their warmth spilling into the room as family members gathered close. The flicker of flames illuminated faces bent over handiwork, spinning, weaving, carving, and the soft crackle of wood filled the silence. Outside, the landscape shifted. Trees stood bare against the gray sky, their leaves long gone, leaving only skeletal branches swaying in the wind. The fields, once busy with labor, lay empty and still. The air smelled different, cleaner, sharper, with the scent of wood smoke and the distant tang of snow yet to come. By now, the livestock had been brought close to the village. Cows and sheep were housed in barns at night, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Chickens roosted in coops lined with straw, and pigs rooted through the last scraps of autumn's bounty. Feeding the animals became a daily ritual, with hay carried in great bundles and water brought before it could freeze solid.
The final preparations for winter food storage were made. Barrels of salted meat were checked for leaks, and smoked hams were hung high to keep them away from pests. Root cellars were inspected for dampness, and sacks of grain were moved to dry corners. Clay jars of honey and preserved fruit were placed within easy reach, ready to be brought out when fresh supplies were gone. As evenings grew longer, storytelling became more common. Families would gather by the fire, the older members recalling tales of past winters, both the hard ones and the mild ones. Children listened wide-eyed to stories of deep snow, frozen rivers, and the clever ways people had survived when supplies ran low. These moments were more than entertainment. They were a passing down of memory and wisdom, reminders of resilience. The church bell still rang on Sundays, its sound carrying further in the crisp air. Attendance was steady, not only for worship, but for the comfort of community. Hymns rose into the cool air, voices mingling as a reminder that no one faced the coming season alone. Sometimes after the service, people lingered outside, stamping their feet to keep warm while trading small news, whether someone's cow had gone dry or if a certain family might need help chopping more wood. The first true frost of the season was always a marker. After that night, everyone knew winter was truly on its way. On such mornings, the village awoke to a world transformed. Frost glittered on every surface, and the air was so cold it stunned the skin. Work outside was kept brief, and the warmth of the fire felt even more precious upon returning indoors. In these final weeks before winter's full grip, there was a sense of both readiness and apprehension. The people had done what they could. Their stores were as full as they would be, their homes as sturdy as they could make them.
The rest would depend on the weather and on fate. Some winters came gently, others harshly. No one could predict which lay ahead. And so the villagers lived between two worlds, still able to move about the land, but already drawing inward, conserving strength. The wind began to carry the faintest scent of snow, and the days seemed to whisper a single, quiet truth. It would not be long now.
The first snow of the season came silently in the night. When the villagers awoke, the world had been remade. The fields, the rooftops, the winding paths, everything lay under a smooth, unbroken blanket of white. Smoke rose straight into the still air from the chimneys, and the only sounds were the soft creak of wooden doors and the muffled crunch of boots breaking the surface of the snow. At first, the snowfall felt almost magical. Children were allowed outside to play for a while, their laughter ringing through the cold air as they tossed handfuls of powder or slid down small hills. But soon the novelty gave way to the reality of the season's demands. Paths needed to be cleared, water brought in before the buckets froze solid, and animals fed despite the snow that now covered the ground. The days were short, so short that it often seemed as though daylight itself was in retreat. Dawn arrived late, casting a pale glow that never quite warmed the air, and dusk came early, the sky fading from gray to black in what felt like moments. Inside, the fire was never allowed to go out, and someone was always tending to it, adding logs or shifting the embers to keep the heat steady. Indoor life took on a different rhythm. Without the demands of planting or harvesting, there was more time for quiet tasks, mending clothes, weaving baskets, repairing tools. Yet the work was no less important. It was simply different. Wool was carded and spun into thick yarn, and knitting became a daily occupation, producing mittens, socks, and scarves. Food preparation also became a central activity. Large pots of stew simmered for hours over the fire, filling the air with the scent of root vegetables, dried herbs, and bits of salted meat. Bread was baked in heavy ovens, the crust crackling as it cooled, while cheese was cut carefully to make it last through the weeks. Meals were simple but filling, designed to warm the body and sustain energy in the cold. Outside, the snow was both a challenge and a shield. It slowed travel, making journeys to neighboring villages rare, but it also insulated the land, protecting winter crops and covering the frozen earth. The villagers knew how to move in it, tying straw around boots to keep them from slipping, using sleds to carry heavy loads, and marking paths with branches so that drifts would not confuse them during storms. The animals required constant care. Cows stayed in the barn, their breath steaming in the dim light. Milking continued, though yields were smaller, and the milk was often turned into butter or soft cheese immediately to prevent spoilage. Chickens were let out only briefly, and their water had to be thawed each day. Dogs and cats, valued for their usefulness in guarding and pest control, curled close to the hearth whenever they could. Winter nights were long, so long that they seemed to stretch endlessly. To fill the time, families turned to stories, songs, and small games. Shadows danced on the walls as tales were told of ancestors, of past winters, and of strange happenings in the forest beyond the village. Sometimes the wind would howl around the corners of the house, and the flames would flicker as though listening to the stories themselves. There was also a watchfulness in winter. Storms could come suddenly, burying the village in deep snow and making even the short walk to the barn a dangerous task. Everyone learned to read the signs: a change in the color of the sky, a sudden stillness in the air, the way the smoke from the chimneys began to fall instead of rise. When such signs appeared, shutters were fastened tight, extra wood was brought inside, and families prepared to wait out the storm together. Though harsh, the season also brought moments of beauty. On clear nights, the sky was a field of stars, brighter than in any other time of year, and the snow reflected their light so that the world seemed to glow faintly in the dark. On sunny days, the surface of the snow sparkled as though scattered with countless tiny jewels, and in the stillness of the frozen air, every sound, a crow's call, a distant bell, carried farther than in the busy seasons. As the first month of winter passed, the villagers settled into its rhythm. The initial shock of cold and snow was behind them, replaced by the steady endurance that would carry them through until spring. They had warmth, food, and each other, and in the long, quiet hours by the fire, they learned again the slow patience of the season. The heart of winter arrived quietly, yet with an unshakable grip. The cold deepened until it felt as though it had seeped into the very stones of the houses. The air outside was sharp enough to sting the skin within seconds, and even indoors one could feel the chill pressing in at the edges, creeping through cracks in the walls and under the doors. The snow outside had grown into tall drifts, sculpted by the wind into smooth, frozen shapes. Paths had to be re-cleared almost daily, and in some places the drifts reached as high as a man's shoulders. The roofs groaned under the weight, and every so often someone would climb up carefully to push the heavy snow down with a wooden shovel. The cold made every small task more difficult. Water froze in buckets within minutes, so it had to be fetched and used quickly. Firewood burned faster in the deep cold, and so more was needed. Men and older boys took turns trudging to the woodpile, breaking apart logs with numb fingers, the sound of the axe echoing in the frosted air. Inside, life revolved entirely around the hearth. The fire was never allowed to die, even at night. Someone, often the oldest awake or the lightest sleeper, would rise in the dark hours to stir the embers and add fresh wood. The room closest to the fire was the warmest place in the house, and beds were piled with every available blanket, fur, or quilt to keep the sleepers warm in the colder corners. The animals were equally vulnerable to the deep cold. In the barns, thick bedding was laid down daily, and doors were kept closed as much as possible. The cow's breath hung in the still air, and frost clung to the edges of their ears. Chickens huddled together in their roosts, and the pigs buried themselves deep in the straw. Even the dogs, usually eager to roam, stayed near the buildings and sought shelter as soon as the work was done. Food became more precious in these weeks. Fresh supplies were long gone, and meals relied heavily on what had been stored in the autumn. Dried beans, root vegetables, grain, and salted meat formed the bulk of the diet. The women cooked slowly, letting soups and stews simmer for hours, so that every bit of warmth and flavor could be drawn from the ingredients. Bread was baked less frequently to conserve fuel, and portions were measured carefully to ensure the stores would last until the thaw. Isolation was perhaps the hardest part of deep winter. Travel to other villages was nearly impossible, and even moving about within the village could be dangerous during storms. Days blurred together, marked only by small routines: feeding animals, fetching water, mending clothes. Time stretched, slow and heavy, under the weight of the season. To fight the monotony, people turned to small forms of entertainment. Knitting, carving, and embroidery filled idle hands. Children were given simple games: carved wooden figures, knucklebones, and dice. Storytelling grew even more elaborate, with neighbors occasionally braving the cold to visit and trade tales. The dark evenings were lit with laughter, and the glow of the hearth, small but significant defenses against the endless cold. Sometimes the night brought strange sounds, the creak of wood under frost, the sudden crack of ice on the river, or the distant howl of wolves made the villagers listen in silence. The animals stayed close, sensing the danger in the dark. It was in these moments that the safety of sturdy walls and a good fire was most deeply felt. Religious observances also played a role in enduring the coldest weeks. The midwinter feast, though smaller than in autumn, was still held, a shared meal to remind everyone that even in the depths of the season there was cause for gratitude. Candles were lit, prayers were spoken, and the flickering light seemed to hold back the long night for a while. But winter also tested patience. Tempers could fray in the close quarters, and disagreements sometimes flared over small things, whose turn it was to fetch wood, or whether too much grain had been used in a meal. These moments passed, but they left a reminder of how much the season demanded of both body and spirit. Still, beneath the hardship, there was a quiet strength. Each day survived was another step toward the thaw. The villagers knew that beyond the snow and ice, the earth still slept, waiting to awaken. Until then, they endured, warmed by the knowledge that they faced the cold together. The first signs of change were subtle. A slightly softer breeze on certain afternoons, a faint difference in the way the snow lay on the ground. Still, winter's grip remained strong, and no one was foolish enough to trust these brief moments of mildness. In the village, people spoke quietly about the weather, remembering other years when such warmth had been followed by sudden, cruel storms. Daily life was still shaped by the cold. Every trip outside began with careful preparation, layers of wool, thick boots, and a scarf drawn high over the mouth. The breath froze instantly in the air, hanging in faint clouds that drifted and vanished. The snow, packed hard by months of trampling, crunched loudly underfoot. Inside the homes, the fires burned low during the day to conserve wood. Work was done near the hearth whenever possible, sewing, carving, mending harnesses. The smell of smoke and wool filled the rooms. Occasionally, the fire would be stoked higher to heat water for washing clothes, a difficult task in such weather. Laundry was hung near the fire to dry, giving the room a damp warmth that lingered for hours. Food stores were carefully monitored. The root cellar, cool and dark, still held onions, turnips, and a few sacks of grain. Barrels of salted meat stood against one wall, and dried herbs hung from the beams above. The women planned meals with precision, making sure every ingredient was used wisely. A large pot of stew might simmer for half the day, the scent slowly filling the house and drawing in anyone who passed through the door. The animals also required constant care. The barns were drafty, and straw had to be replaced often to keep the bedding dry. Buckets of water were carried from the well, each one heavy with ice forming around the edges before it reached its destination. Sometimes the men would break the ice in the troughs with the back of an axe to make sure the animals could drink. Social visits between houses were rare but treasured. When a neighbor appeared at the door, stamped the snow from his boots, and stepped into the warm glow of the fire, the air in the room seemed to lift. There would be tea or weak ale, a few shared pieces of bread or dried fruit, and conversation that wandered between news of the weather, family matters, and old stories passed down through the years. The children, restless after months indoors, were given chores to burn off their energy, fetching wood, sweeping snow from the paths, or helping in the barns. They also invented games, building small forts out of snow, or playing at hunting with sticks for spears. Their laughter, though muffled by scarves and hats, was a bright sound in the white stillness. Some evenings were given over entirely to storytelling. The oldest members of the village would recall the winters of their youth, some harsher, some easier, but all remembered in vivid detail. The young listened closely, knowing that these tales carried lessons about patience, caution, and the strength found in community. By late in the month, the sun lingered a little longer each day. The difference was small, just a few extra minutes of light, but it was noticed and quietly celebrated. A sense of anticipation began to grow, though tempered by the knowledge that the season could still turn fierce again without warning. The change came gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. Days grew a fraction warmer, the sun's light gaining a faint golden tone instead of the pale silver it had worn all winter. Yet the mornings still bit at the skin, and the ground remained frozen solid. Travelers passing through the village brought news from other places. Rivers beginning to crack, snow thinning in the lowlands, and the first migrations of birds returning to warmer regions. Such reports were met with cautious hope. People had lived through years when spring came early and years when it seemed winter would never end. The roads were still buried deep under packed snow and ice, making travel slow. Sleds were more useful than carts, and most journeys were made only when necessary. The forests surrounding the village were quiet, except for the occasional creak of frozen branches or the distant call of a raven. In the barns, the animals stirred more often, moving restlessly in their stalls. The farmers knew this was a sign. Nature itself was preparing for the change of season. Cows would soon need to be turned out to pasture, and that meant the fields had to be checked and cleared of any winter damage. Inside the homes, preparations for spring had already begun in small ways. Seed sacks were inspected, tools sharpened, and new handles carved for those worn down by years of use. Some families had saved scraps of cloth to make light garments for the warmer months, sewing them by the fire in anticipation. The younger villagers were eager for the thaw, speaking often of fishing in the river, hunting in the forests, and walking through green fields again. The elders listened with patient smiles, knowing that the work of spring would be far from easy, but also that it was a welcome change from the confinement of winter. The snow began to soften in the afternoons, forming a slick surface that refroze each night. Icicles thick as a man's arm hung from the eaves, dripping steadily in the daytime. The sound of water trickling along the edges of the roads was like music, a sign that the frozen world was slowly beginning to breathe again. As the days warmed, the villagers took longer walks, checking on the state of fences, wells, and paths. Small repairs were made where possible, though many would have to wait until the ground thawed completely. Each new patch of bare earth uncovered felt like a promise. But winter had one last show of strength yet to give, as it often did. The skies could darken in an hour, and snow would sweep down again, erasing the signs of thaw and reminding everyone that the season was not finished. These moments tested patience, but they also reinforced the resilience the villagers had built over long months. By the end of this period, the balance had shifted. The cold was still there, but it no longer dominated every thought. People looked ahead, making plans for planting, repairing, and building. Life was beginning to move forward once again, even if winter still lingered at the edges. It was on a clear, bright morning. that the change finally became undeniable. The snow, though still deep in places, was pocked with holes where the earth showed through. The air carried the faint scent of thawed soil, a smell so subtle it seemed almost imagined after months of nothing but frost and smoke. The river had begun to move again, breaking its icy bonds with soft groans and cracks. Villagers gathered at its edge to watch the slow, deliberate progress of the water, each ripple a reminder that time was moving forward. The children threw sticks into the current, cheering when they floated away. Work increased in pace and purpose. Fences were mended, tools repaired, and paths cleared. The fields were examined carefully, their frozen furrows soon to be turned and planted. The animals, too, felt the change, lowing eagerly when led out into the sun, pawing at the earth as if testing it for readiness. The evenings still brought cold, but it was a different kind of cold, lighter, less oppressive. Fires were lit more for comfort than for survival. People lingered outside their homes after dark, speaking softly under the stars, their breath no longer rising in thick clouds. Inside, the talk turned to plans, which crops to sow first, which repairs to prioritize, which journeys might be made before the busyness of summer set in. There was laughter again, unforced and frequent, as though a great weight had been lifted. The storytellers still spoke in the evenings, but now their tales were of beginnings, planting, building, journeys taken under warm skies. The children listened with shining eyes, imagining futures that had seemed impossible only weeks before. When the first green shoots pushed through the soil, it was as if the entire village breathed in unison. Winter had not been defeated. It never was, but it had passed, as it always did. And in its wake, it left a community bound more tightly together, strengthened by months of shared hardship and quiet endurance.